afternoon, everyone. My name is Carly Rygard, and I'm a member of the Programs and Outreach Department at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn, hosted in partnership with the Maryland State Archives and Maryland Four Centuries Project. Before we begin, I would like to remind everybody that you can enter any questions or comments for the presenter into the comment or chat box below the video. These will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's program following the presentation. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Owen from the Maryland State Archives.
Hi, Carly. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Owen Lurie. I am the Outreach Coordinator here at the Maryland State Archives. These Lunch and Learn lectures are an opportunity for us to hear the stories of Maryland's people and to highlight the use of primary source materials and the value of archives in uncovering shared heritage. The Maryland State Archives holds records of permanent value to the state of Maryland and serves as the state's historical agency. If you are interested in exploring our records for your own research, I do hope that you'll come and check us out. You can contact us and schedule a research appointment on our website, msa.maryland.gov. Our program today comes from Anjela Barnes and is entitled The Land Remembers, Piscataway Stories of Continuity, one that I'm looking forward to a great deal. I also hope that you will join us next month on January 8th for the first program of 2026, when my colleagues Elaine Rice-Bachman, Christopher Kinsel, and Robin Gower will give us a sneak preview of the newly restored Old Treasury Building in Annapolis, the oldest public building in the state, which has been closed to the public for a very long time. You can find a full list of our programs, including videos of past presentations on our website, and you can, of course, from the Pratt Library at prattlibrary.org. Now to introduce today's speaker, here's Bert Kummerow, Founding Director of the Maryland Four Centuries Project.
Thanks, Owen, and welcome everyone to the holiday season and our last Lunch and Learn lecture of 2025. I'd like to thank, as always, our great partners, the Maryland State Archives and the Enoch Pratt Free Library. We're all committed to bringing you the best new research on Maryland's long history. The beginning of the country's 250th anniversary next month brings new opportunities to our Maryland's Four Centuries Project. Working with the state's 250th Commission, we have created the Maryland Mosaic, and we've collected 150 historic people, places, events, objects, documents, and structures that are firsts not only in Maryland, but also in the entire nation. These firsts, like the young 19th century African-American chess master in Frederick and the first ice cream factory, show how influential and interesting Maryland's story has been. As always, we are a small state with a big history. These institutions throughout the 23 counties in Baltimore City who own these firsts have an opportunity to tell their own stories. Stay tuned during 2026 as our proud history storytellers feature their firsts and present a wide variety of programs all over Maryland, all the way from Berlin in the east to Oakland in the west. The old line state will step out during the anniversary with tales of our big history. Today's talk is about the history of important Indian land that is one of the firsts in our Maryland Mosaic. But before I get to that history, I want to give you some background about that land since the mid-20th century. This Native American land is directly across the Potomac River from George Washington's Mount Vernon. A big mission was to protect the view from Mount Vernon, and President John F. Kennedy signed a bill in 1961 creating Piscataway Park, and that was designed to protect the easements on the Maryland side of the Potomac. There were threatened developments like a tank farm and an amusement park, but the Accokeek Foundation, where I served as a board member, saved the land and the view in Piscataway Park. The foundation was planning a national colonial farm, and I thought that was a great idea, a farm for a middling 18th century planter right across from the rich planter at Mount Vernon. As the research and the plans for recreating a colonial farm made good progress, the Accokeek Foundation also developed a native tree arboretum, a Save the Chestnut Tree project, and an eco farm. And in addition, the planned colonial plantation had an authentic dwelling, period animals, gardens, and crops, and a good living history interpretive program. In the midst of this development, this land, which was the center of the Piscataway tribe, was neglected. This tract of land is most important, even sacred, because of its Native American story. The story holds the entire history to the present of the Native people we now call the Piscataway Kanoi. The main village of these people was here, and it was visited by the Maryland settlers in 1634 before they created St. Mary's City. During the subsequent 140 years before 1776, the Piscataways and other tribes in the Chesapeake region were chased out by the tide of European settlers. Many survived in southern Maryland and reemerged in the 20th century to revive their links to a proud past. That is the story that you will hear today. Finally, the Piscataway story has been woven nicely into the programs at the Accokeek Foundation. I can't think of a better person to tell this story than the Accokeek Foundation's executive director, Anjela Barnes. As an authentic representative of the Piscataways, born and raised in southern Maryland, Anjela has worked hard to bring us the important story of this land. It's a story about a strong and a proud Indian culture, and we're all grateful for what she has brought us. Please join me in welcoming Anjela Barnes.
Thank you, Bert. You have me blushing. That was such a nice introduction. And thank you, everyone. It's such an honor to be here today and share this space with you all. Before I begin our program, I believe it's important to acknowledge the people and lands where we present today. And I have a recording to share that will offer a greeting and warm welcome from one of our Piscataway Newman, spoken in our ancestral language.
Religishku. Ni ko Jose no wenge, o Piscataway comigo yakio kana hagai. Tuenama, o ke lanko moke, comigo yakio kana hagai. Good morning. My name is Rico Newman. I'm a member of the Tropical Band of the historic Piscataway Chiefdom. I want to welcome you all here to the homeland of the people today known as the Piscataway. Historically, the Piscataway were comprised of more than 13 different tribes or parts of the nation. Today, we're all known under the singular title of Piscataways. And again, I welcome you to our homeland. And today I want to share with you some.
So as Rika had mentioned, our territory is very broad, and I wanted to just show this map here that includes the Piscataway territory, which extends from the western shores of the Chesapeake all the way through to the Potomac shores and actually up to the foothills of the Appalachian mountain range here. Many people may have seen this map before. There's a link here called, it's a wiki map. It's called Native Land CA, but it really shows the depth of the diversity of the nations that made up of Turtle Island, which is what our people call the Americas, which includes North America, Central America, South America. And it's really interesting when you look at the overlay of the many Native nations of the Chesapeake region, that there weren't really hard, fast boundaries as we know today. When we're looking at the jurisdictional differences between the state of Maryland and the state of Virginia, for example, and those hard boundaries, you really see a blending and a confluence. In fact, Piscataway is Algonquian, and it means the confluence or the blending of waters. One of the things that's really important to note when you're looking at this map and noting all the different Native communities that are identified is the language is descriptive. It's describing the surrounding areas of the people. And so when the early settlers arrived and they wanted to find out, who are you? And even today we ask, who are your people? We really describe our presence as being of the land. So I will introduce myself as Anjela Barnes. I am Piscataway. I am of the lands of where the waters blend. And that just gives you a little example of the nuances of the Native culture and the relationship with the landscape. And so the Accokeek Foundation, we're located in Piscataway Park. It is the traditional homelands of the Piscataway people, both past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and the people who have stewarded this land throughout the generation. And it's our honor to continue as stewards of the land. So before I continue, I'd love if you can drop in the comment maybe a little bit of where you are from and the people whose land you are watching from today. I just have a little screenshot of the image here, but if you know of the people of the lands where you are from today, feel free to drop that in the comments and we'll just kind of see that and share and introduce each other online today that way. Great, thank you. So continue to just not acknowledge that and drop that in the comments as we go on. So starting with the preservation story, the Accokeek Foundation's role in preserving and protecting and caring for this land started, as Bert referenced, way back in the 1950s. In the 1950s, this land was under threat of development. And thankfully, our founding president was a congresswoman from Ohio. The Mount Vernon Ladies Associations, it was essentially their board, Congresswoman Frances Payne Bolton. She purchased 500 acres of farmland and created one of the nation's earliest land trusts, which is us, the Accokeek Foundation. And furthermore, in 1961, a large landscape conservation effort led to the creation of Piscataway Park. Again, the first national park established to preserve a historic vista, which is that of the view of Mount Vernon from across the Potomac River. And ultimately, this resulted in the preservation of a significant part of the traditional Piscataway territory and the stories which this land holds. One of the things to note, unfortunately, this large landscape effort that led to this preservation, there was really little or no reference to the known existence of this area or the Piscataway people in the enabling legislation. In fact, even the Accokeek Foundation's own original incorporating documents failed to mention the Piscataway, but reference the historic sites and relics, trees, plants, and wildlife rapidly disappearing from an area of great natural beauty along the Maryland shore of the historic Potomac River. It has our documents and our language and our mission has since been amended and corrected since this time, but it's just really important to note that though there was definitely an awareness of the Piscataway people's presence, in fact, you named the park after the Piscataway people for that purpose, that the legislation and the original incorporating documents of organization did not include that language explicitly. In fact, this is an image of from the dedication of the park, which took place in 1998. It actually took 7 years of collecting records and aggregating all of the land deeds to be able to put in for conservation easement. Piscataway Park is one of these unique national parks in that it encompasses about 5,000 acres and goes along 6 miles of the Potomac River shoreline. It spans across 2 jurisdictional counties in the state of Maryland. That's Prince George's County and Charles County. and it comprises of both public and privately owned property. And all of that property is held under scenic conservation easements, again, to preserve the historic vistas, both from Mount Vernon, which is about here on the map, and also we have Fort Washington Park. So when you're looking at this map, all this dark green area is considered Piscataway Park. It is. That's a great question. Sorry, I'll answer the questions afterwards. But yes, Fort Washington Park and Fort Washington Marina, that is part of Piscataway Park holistically. And in the photo here, you have at the dedication, and just beyond Congresswoman Bolton's hat to the left side of the photo, I believe, is Mount Vernon across the river. And this photo was taken with the then Chief Turkey Tayak, along with our founder and Congresswoman Frances Payne Bolton. I love this photo because it shows the image of Moyon, the traditional homelands of the Piscataway people, which is where Piscataway Park is and what it is protecting. So it really shows a different perspective of the map that I showed previously of the landscape of the traditional capital of the Piscataway chiefdom that we call Moyon, which translates loosely to everything is here. And when you're looking at this image, again, on the bottom half of the map is Maryland, the shoreline of Maryland. And then on the upper half of the map is the shoreline of Virginia. And when we have visitors and students coming to the park, we go out to the river and point at all the waterways and the confluence of the freshwater creeks and marshes coming to the Potomac here and the lands across the river. And I pointed out that everything you see here is Moyon. It wasn't Virginia. It wasn't Maryland at the time of the Piscataway prior to settlement. It was home. And it was more than home. It was the principal village of the chiefdom. And I'll explain that a little bit more as I describe it to children when they come out for the full school groups. We understand the concept of a nation. Let's use the United States as an example. It is a nation of states. And each state has its own governor and its own governing structure. And each state has there's an umbrella to that governance structure, our president that is in the capital of Washington, D.C. The Piscataway chiefdom is very much the same. In fact, the Constitution of the United States was built off of the democratic philosophies of the Haudenosaunee, which are our friends to the north of upstate New York. Colloquially, people refer to them as the Iroquois, but Haudenosaunee is the traditional name for the Six Nations. And that is how our Constitution was loosely based off of this democratic process of you have the Tayak or the Chief of Chiefs, which is the general leader of many villages with its own democratic leadership or minor chiefs, if you will. So when we're looking at this map a little bit, the reason why it was called Everything is Here, Moyon, is because it was rich and abundant with life sources, natural resources, as most people refer them to. You have your rich, fertile land for farming and agricultural practices. You have your healthy forest that provides your timber, the woodlands that have the understory of plant material, foods. Accokeek actually translates to a place of wild fruit, which is a reference to nut-bearing trees that grows all throughout the area. You have the freshwater marshes and the wetlands that have plant and food that nourishes the communities from Tukwahoo or Arrow Arm, corn, and you also have wild rice. And then also very important are these shad nurseries. You have these freshwater creeks, Piscataway Creek as it's called, that blends in and flows into the Potomac, Doe Creek on the other side, Little Hunting Creek. And within these freshwater creeks were natural shad nurseries. Shadfish would return in the springtime when the shad bush blooms, approximately around nowadays it's February to March when the ospreys also return to the region. And that was an indicator for our people that it was time to return to the waters and that the winter hungry time was nearing its end. And when the shad returned, there was an abundance of food. And in fact, George Washington enjoyed the profit of those shad fisheries during his time on these lands as well. So I'll progress on and talk more about the ancestral capital and the sacred burial known as Moyon. Again, these lands are considered sacred. These are where our ancestors are buried. It is still called Moyon by our people, as opposed to the archaeological Accokeek Creek, or as we know it as Piscataway Park as a national park. During the late 1930s, the local homeowner who was living in this area had come doing farming. As farming does, you're tilling up the land. You start to notice some artifacts. And in fact, discovered ossuaries, which are large burial sites. And just to kind of clarify, it's not a mass burial. Traditionally, our people would return our ancestors back to the land so that they can be reconnected with the ancestors, the spirit world, in the same location. And so that's what an ossuary is. And there were several of them in this land, and unfortunately, a number of human burials were excavated during this time period. There were 5 ossuaries discovered at Moyon or Accokeek Creek, and over 1,000 individual bodies were removed from the land, unfortunately. But had it not been for the preservation of Piscataway Park, the desecration of these sacred lands by way of development of a wastewater treatment facility, or later on a power plant, which were both planned as and on this landscape as a development area, it led to protecting it. And it also led to requests by Chief Turkey Tyack during the park's creation that he wished to be buried with the ancestors and that our people would always be able to visit. When Chief Turkey Tyack passed in 1978, his wishes to be buried were postponed a year of advocacy and outreach in order for an act of Congress to take place. And ultimately, in 1979, Chief Turkey Tyack was buried here beneath the cedar tree. This is his one of his granddaughters, Gabrielle Tyack, in this photo, standing at the sacred tree, where Chief Turkey Tyack is buried amongst with ancestors in one of the ossuaries that is protected by the park. And today, many Piscataway from the community continue to visit and hold sacred ceremony in partnership with the Park Service there. So this presentation is going to flip-flop back and forth throughout time. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the historical record that most people are familiar with and blend it in with the kind of oral traditions and history that I know as it's been passed on to me. So we're very familiar with Captain John Smith and his voyages of the Chesapeake region. And one of the ways that we are able to ensure that there is credibility to our oral histories is by layering it with the historical written record, either through archaeology or through some of the journals and working with like the state archives to be able to map that together. So this is an image of one of the several voyages of John Smith. And in 1608, he mapped all these villages all up and down the Chesapeake region. He made actually 2 voyages specifically into the part of the Chesapeake region and the Potomac as well. And so you can see here on the map the references to the villages from Anacostia, Piscataway, Mattawoman, Patuxent to the western side of the it's Calvert County area, Choptank, Rappahannock. These are all the tribes of the Chesapeake region. And when you're looking at the Potomac River here, which winds its way up towards DC, the Potomac River flows out towards the Ohio River Valley. We call that the front door, right? The front door to our homelands. So in your homes, you welcome people you're not so familiar with, the delivery people, they all come knocking on the front door, right? But our neighbors to the east and to the south, all along the James River, the Rappahannock, they were our cousins. They were close kin. They were relatives. They were friends. So they came through the back door, which comes up from the Chesapeake area. And this was one of the ways we were one of the major trade routes, in fact, for the tribes from the Chesapeake region on north through Pennsylvania and out towards New York, and then also from the western tribes. So Anacostia actually, or Nacotchtank, often is confused as a separate from the Piscataway. It is part of the chiefdom, but it's a place of trade. And so it was our trading center. So when tribes were coming from upstate New York area, the western Ohio region, the Ohio River Valley area, they were coming through to the Nacotchtank at that trading center and bringing material from the west that we did not have access to here on the east, and we were trading with the materials and resources that we had here on the east, like river rock or shells and things of that nature. And so that's just a little nuance of the trade routes and the villages that are noted here. So moving on through history, this image depicts a stained glass window, which actually is still in one of the oldest continuing manors of a Catholic church. It's the St. Ignatius in the middle. It is located in Port Tobacco, high on a hill, overlooking where the Port Tobacco River and the Potomac River merge together. And this is an image of the baptism of the Tayak at the time, Kitimakun, in 1640. So our people were converted to Catholicism in the early colonial period. And in fact, it was through those colonial records, or those Catholic records rather, that we were able to trace our lineage back and to obtain recognition. I'll go into that a little bit further later. But the story goes that Kitimakun, the Tayak, or the chief of chiefs at the time, that he became sick the traditional medicines could not cure or heal. I believe it was an English-born illness that it was caused by, and then the English medicine that was used to treat it healed him. And I believe, as the story goes, it was a belief that that is what inspired him to convert to Christianity, and then our people followed suit. And it was through these Catholic identities that our people were not identified as Native people, as Indian people. We were identified as Catholics, and adopted a lot of the Catholic rites and the Catholic traditions, which in a lot of ways really were similar to our own traditions. So, for example, in the late August area, there is the Catholic tradition called the Assumption of Mary that coincides very well with our traditional Green Corn Festival. And so it was through these church picnics that we were able to continue to honor our own traditions under the identity of a Catholic. This image here kind of outlines the reserved lands. In 1666, the Maryland colony had adopted it was kind of like a treaty. It was the Peace and Amenity Treaty, and it reserved the lands for the Piscataway, basically from the Piscataway Creek up here. Oops, go back. Piscataway Creek up here where we are at Piscataway Park. I always say you can look at this little shark's fin, or I sometimes call the Dr. Seuss hat, as kind of where Piscataway Park is. So this is Piscataway Creek. And so in the Articles of Peace and Amenity in 1666, it identifies the lands from Piscataway Creek all the way down to Mattawoman Creek, which is here between what is now known as Indian Head, between Indian Head and Marbury and Nanjemoy area here. So in the outline of black is the reserved lands according to that record. And one of the things I find interesting, we've been working with our archaeological friends from Historic St. Mary's City and elsewhere to really overlay the archaeology with, again, that historical record. And this map here is actually from a landscape walkover and a study of the Nanjemoy, Indian Head, Mattawoman area. And the purple lines here are actually tracing and following traditional native trails, like walking trails, which coincidentally, a lot of our roads are overlaid where these old Indian trails were. And the one part when I was looking at this that I thought was really interesting is these two purple lines that come to a confluence here at the Port Tobacco River, rather. And so you can see these trails coming from the capital, coming from the central village of the chiefdom, coming down through here to Port Tobacco River. And over here with this tree and the sign is actually an existing sign at the Port Tobacco River Park. This is the Port Tobacco, and kind of up north a little bit is the St. Ignatius Church. But the thing that I thought was interesting when I was hiking this trail, and I noticed this, is this tree behind the sign. It was an old tree. I call her grandmother tree. She unfortunately is no longer standing here, but as you can tell, she has weathered many storms and many moons. But you see this sharp angle of the shape of the tree. And when you're hiking in the woods, there's a lot of what we call above the ground archaeology and signs of indigenous presence. And this is one of them. When a young tree or a sapling is just starting, it was common to use that sapling to bend the sharp angle to create a trail marker of a sorts. This is before the day of using paint markers or other signs to indicate which direction you're going. And I thought this was interesting because I was like curious, what is this pointing to? And when you look at the map, what it's pointing to is this other native community, the Nanjemoy Indian town that is listed, that is labeled here at the bottom. So again, there are many signs in our natural environment, both on our maps of our rivers, our waterways, and also just when we're out in nature that kind of indicates the presence of the historical presence of our native people. I mentioned earlier about the abundance of food sources at Moyon, but foods and medicines all come from, the earth, right? And we hear and we talk about like how Native people live in harmony with nature, and it's true, but that's because it's how it sustains you. It sustains life. The Creator gifted us with an abundance of foods and plants and animals, and the tree people were here first. And we learn a lot from our animal kin, our plant kin. We watch the great heron use their spear-like beaks to be able to capture fish. So, we adapted and used spears to be able to capture fish. You watch your animal kin and see how they are able to feed themselves to be able to learn and adapt technologies in order to provide foods and medicine for your own community here. So this is just a quick little overview of that relationship. And one of the challenges with the treaties and the removal from our traditional home sites along the rivers, along the waterways, is that access to our homelands was becoming more and more a challenge, right? And that treaty, it gave us provision to continue to access for hunting, foraging, fishing, and crabbing on our own lands. Unfortunately, that law was written in such a way that it actually stripped away land ownership and eventually placed English squarely into a position of power and worked to remove the cultural lifeways, and these barriers continue to limit access for food and medicine. Kind of moving on, we're fast forwarding probably about 100 years at this point. This is about between early settlement from 1608 all the way to the mid 18th century, 1770s to 1790. Our people, they were resilient and strategic. There was definitely lots of movement or immigration out of the area. There are points along the Ohio River Valley area going up into Pennsylvania and upstate New York area where you see movement of our people through documentation, through treaties. And you had movement of the folks, the village of Moyon that followed the Tayak to an area that's called Heater's Island or Conoy Island. You have movement. William Penn actually offered, refuge. There was a lot of dispute over boundaries of the colonies initially that kind of caused a little confusion at the time of where people were, because again, we did not have this concept of land ownership. We belonged to the land. We did not own the land, and so did not have an understanding of clear boundaries of where we were. But the thing that is really important here, there's 2 points here. We often talk about Piscataway Conoy. There are 2 recognized state tribes, Piscataway Indian Nation, Piscataway Conoy tribe. And the word Conoy actually is an Iroquois word or a Siouan language-based word, and it means below the rapids. And so when our peeped up into the Pennsylvania, upstate New York area, into Haudenosaunee, the Siouan-based language territory, that's what we were referred to as the Conoy, because we were the people below the rapids. And those rapids are Great Falls. So if you kind of think about the Potomac River and where we are talking about, Heater's Island is just around Great Falls area. And a lot of this immigration was brought on by, again, impacts of colonial presence in our area. There were attacks also by neighboring tribal communities, all familiar probably with the Bacon's Rebellion and the Dogue and Susquehannock and Seneca. And a lot of that really was as a result of the fur trade. There was a lot of competition for resources. And the fur trade actually was the early economic driver of the colonies. And there was, competition between the French and the English for their furs. And they partnered with the native communities present and where they were colonizing. And that created some tension amongst our people again. And one other thing that is really, really important is that while most of the historical record does indicate that Piscataway people departed the region during this time period, a large number did remain and living and adapting to colonial ways. And some even went on and were tenant farmers on lands that were once home. And I love this article here. As we've been kind of really diving into the historical record and really thinking about the space that visitors come, that's known as the National Colonial Farm, and the 18th century recreated farmstead that is at Piscataway Park, I've often said, I was like, well, couldn't a Piscataway live in a home like that? And I've had people say, well, how do you know? And I say, well, I'm here because I can tell you that our ancestors lived alongside and farmed and worked the land alongside with other settlers from England and Scotland and Ireland. The tenant farmers were not the wealthy ones, right? The tenant farming was something of, you had your indentured servitude, you served your time, and then you acquired land. And those tenant farmers needed help. And who was there? The Piscataway. So this article is from 1912. It's a Washington Star article. And it's actually, you can find it on the Library of Congress, so it is viewable in public records. So I'll just read a little bit from the text since it's hard to read, but the photo that you see of the man standing in a crop field is a Piscataway person, and there's the homestead, the very modest homestead, and this farm was located in Fort Washington, according to the article. And I love the headline: Piscataway Indians who once ruled East Bank of Potomac still live near Washington. So that 200 period of time between the mid 1700s to the mid 1950s, 60s, I call that the self-preservation period, or the hiding in plain sight. So the article references how this gentleman claims of Piscataway identity, which are generally validated by those Marylanders that are knowledgeable of the people. It also remarks on, even though they have no documentary proof of their descent, they have Indian traditions and Indian traits. These people are scattered over in small territory below Washington. The family name of these folk is Proctor. Many of them live within a few miles of the site of the main village of the Piscataways, the site of which is now covered by Fort Washington. There are a number of these Proctors living in Charles County and Prince George's, scattered eastward to Brandywine. A number of the men of this race claim descent from Kinnamakun and Wahasco. Kinnamakun and Wahasco were both Piscataway Tyaks in the 1600s. They do not read history. It is rather confirmatory of their claim that through the generations they remember such names as Kinnamakun. The people claim Piscataway identity. They have Indian features and possess old bead necklaces, bracelets, and etc. So here in 1912, this journalist was writing about this person, but the tone was very much like, are you sure you know who you are? But how can you say that almost 300 years later, someone remembers the name of a Tyak from the 1600s? So it comes to, how do we know? This is passed down to us from generation to generation. Though we, our elders and now ancestors in many form have maintained and survived in the Southern Maryland area through hiding in plain sight and adapting a lot of the and assimilating, if you will, the colonial and settler, their neighbors' ways of living. Instead of living in long houses, living in farmhouses similar to our colonial neighbors, and growing tobacco for economic purposes as opposed to simply sacred purposes. Tobacco is one of the gifts from the Creator and is a sacred plant that's used for ceremony and prayer as well as medicine. But, kind of also still, you grew the tobacco, you still had tobacco for your own personal use as well. So these photos actually are documented from the Baltimore Sun. They were taken in the 1950s. And the gentleman here in the top, standing up with the headdress, is Chief Turkey Tyak. And he's in the center in the photo below, and also standing and sitting on the porch of the farmhouse. And it was during this time period that he welcomed several members from the Lumbee tribe, which are from primarily North Carolina area. And, Turkey was really, really, really a strong advocate for maintaining our identity and culture, and to continue to make sure we were honoring that and teaching that. And we were able to do, they was able to do that in private on their own land and in their own spaces, not openly in public purview, but it was definitely maintained on their own property. I love this image, especially, I don't know if everybody can see it, but the bottom image, I love it because it just shows, again, that assimilation into, modern culture and identity through the clothing and the styles. You see the Mary Janes on the young woman here, but you also see the blending of clothing styles as well as with the traditional styles. So it's a brief little clip of this video here.
There's a lot of history here prior to European contact, and a lot of history here after European contact. But it's a tremendous holy place. And Indians here from Virginia, and the Indians from up north, the Indians, the Iroquois Confederacy came down here, and they used to have meetings here along the edge of the down here in this area here. They had tremendous amount of feasts down here, a lot of conferences down here, and that it's a place where Indians have always come to.
Splitting away from the Lenni Lenape.
This video is available on YouTube. It's called The Flickering Flame, The Life and Legacy of Turkey Tayac. It's about an hour long, so I'm not going to play the whole thing, but I do recommend you taking a look at that. So kind of fast forward 1950s to about the 1970s, actually 1976 to be precise. And this is around the time period of the American Indian movement's kind of growth. And we call this the resurgence period. So this is coming out of the self-isolation or self-preservation time period, which was about 200 years from the mid 1700s to the mid 1900s, when our people had to, again, hide in plain sight. A lot of it had to do with the laws and the treaties, segregation laws and the Indian Removal Act. There's lots and lots of things that had happened that made it not safe to be openly identifying as a Native person or an Indian at this time. But in the early 1970s, 1972, you had the Trail of Broken Treaties, which was a caravan of tribes from the West who came to Washington, D.C., and to advocate for treaty rights, religious freedom protection. They were petitioning and protesting at the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, in 1972 to bring the 20-point proposal of tribal sovereignty. And further on in 1976, there was a second wave of that protesting at the BIA to follow up on the 20-point proposal. This happened during the U.S. bicentennial celebrations in 1976. And it was during this time, we call this the Trail of Self-Determination, that a young Piscataway man, Billy Tayac, who was the son of Chief Turkey Tayac. He's actually a little older in the picture here. He's a gentleman here with the blue shirt. But he was traveling. The story is, I recall him telling us, he was a traveling, I think, a salesman. He was in D.C., and he bumped into one of the American Indian Movement members and was kind of curious. He was like, "You're wearing a shirt that says American Indian Movement. You are saying you were an Indian." This was not something that was common for our people in Southern Maryland. Kind of keep in mind, Southern Maryland's very isolated. There wasn't really a whole lot of access out of the area until after World War II, and the bridges and whatnot were made, and you didn't have the internet to kind of find out what was going on out west. So it was very unusual to him, and he was inspired by the American Indian movement. And it was about the end of summer, and a lot of the demonstrators were camping out on the grounds of American University, and they needed to vacate before the classes started for the fall semester, and they were invited to stay at a family farmland in Marbury, which actually made the Southern Maryland News headlines, 700 Indians in Marbury. And if you're familiar with the area and you know anything about Marbury, I'll just say it's very much like the Andy Griffith show's Mayberry. It's a very small town, so that definitely would have been a big surprise. But during this time of staying on local Piscataway members' home and farmland, the protesters, they learned about the burial at Accokeek at Piscataway Park. And at the time, there was a cinder block house that had ancestral remains laying on the ground on display for school children to see. And when they learned about this, they were like, this is an atrocity. This cannot be. We must stop this. And ultimately did. And so what you have here in the upper photo, these folks standing around this drum, this is actually the time that the blockhouse was torn down with support from the Park Service, of course, and the ancestral remains were reinterred, and a young cedar tree was planted. And the cedar, again, another sacred gift from the Creator, was an indicator that the ancestors' spirit was realigned and reconnected with the spirit world. And that tree is where Turkey Tayac is buried today. So with that, the spirit of the American Indian movement still remains with many of our relatives who lived and experienced this resurgence of Native pride in the public just 50 years ago. So next year would be the 50th anniversary of this American Indian movement that happened in Maryland at Piscataway Park. I'm going to skip over that for time's sake. So I mentioned earlier the Catholicism that helped lead to state recognition. I will say Piscataway people are a state recognized tribe. We are not a federally recognized tribe as of yet. I will say a lot of that has to do with energy and time. It took our elders nearly 30 years to achieve the documentation of birth, marriage, and death records that were maintained by the Catholic Church. If you're familiar with the recognition process, it's lengthy, it's arduous, it's challenging, but we had our elders, my grandparents among them, have historical lineage all the way back to the creation of the Maryland colony, which was in 1634. And so that's why I said it took a long time, 30 years. And these are photos of that historical moment at the State House, the signing that was authorized by then Governor Martin O'Malley. And it was an emotional day. It was a celebratory day. But, you know, the continuing for sovereign rights and working with our state partners is ongoing. And it takes a lot of education. And sometimes starting with the new administration every time one changes. We continue today to honor and celebrate our culture. We teach people through powwows and exhibitions for non-Native audiences. This helps to connect our histories, our culture with others, but also it helps us to connect with other tribal communities, to share and maintain and celebrate our individual Indigenous culture with each other. And these regalias, or the dress, as you see here, these styles are specific to dance and songs. And I must say, these are not costumes. These are specific to the individual. When they embrace the culture, they work on their own regalia, they work on their own beadwork. A lot of the decorative elements of a regalia is to the specific person's personality, but also their strengths, their skills, their abilities. And the dress style correlates to a dance style, which often correlates to specific prayers and ceremony. So you have traditional styles, you have jingle dress styles, you have fancy styles, but each of them are unique to the individual. And I think this is the last video I will share.
On behalf of the Piscataway Indian Nation, I wish you welcome. Where you're standing at is the capital of the Piscataway Indian Nation. It's called Moyung. We've been here over 12,000 years. Our ancestors are buried in this land. That's what makes this land so sacred. On behalf of the Piscataway Indian Nation, and speaking very humbly on behalf of the Earth Mother, I wish to welcome you here.
Oh, that was from 2016 when the Hukalea Polynesian Voyaging Society had a formal landing and welcoming ceremony at Piscataway Park. So with that, I'm going to close up and just kind of really highlighting a lot of what we do with the Accokeek Foundation at Piscataway Park. We're really focusing today on a Piscataway cultural landscape restoration. Our work within community, within tribal communities, and education and stewarding the landscape, and working with our partners across the Potomac and throughout our state and federal partners as well. We are restoring Indigenous culture and land. We're working in partnership with and support of Piscataway and Indigenous communities throughout the region and Through this, the Accokeek Foundation is working towards restoring hope of community, of spirituality, of diversity, of honor, and resilience. That I say thank you. Winishi, thank you. If you want to have any more information about the Accokeek Foundation, scan this QR code. It goes to our website, which is www.accokeek.org. Thank you again.
Angela, thank you so much. That was a really wonderful presentation. It is certainly not easy to distill several hundred years worth of history into a pretty short period of time. But I think you did a really nice job with that. I think certainly for myself, there's a lot that I learned there as well. We do have a couple of questions, and also people who chiming in about where they were watching from. Most folks were from Maryland. A lot of folks in Baltimore County, and some folks out towards Carroll County, as well as some from Southern Maryland as well. Is that all within the Piscataway territory? If you get up towards Carroll County, does it begin to drift into a different region?
I think there is some overlay, but yes, most of it goes up and outside of the north of Baltimore and out towards the Appalachian region and Western Maryland as well. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. We also have one question, sort of a more simple question is, where is Heaters Island located? I know that it's in the Potomac, but I'm not sure where that is exactly.
I think it is Point of Rocks. I do believe that's the same thing.
Okay, that makes sense. Great. We also have a question about the burials that were disturbed or destroyed. Do we know more about what happened to them when that destruction occurred? I know sometimes with other cemeteries, we are able to kind of fill in some of the blanks.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of record in this in the archaeology. So I can share that I think different places, different institutions are storing and housing a lot of those remains and funerary objects. I can't say exactly where, but various different universities and institutions across the country.
Okay, thank you. Was there ever forced resettlement of the Piscataway, such as we see with the Cherokee and with other groups further west?
No, I wouldn't describe it as forced. It was mostly like what you would consider what happens in wartime. You know, you see it in present day, wars and ongoing things and across the globe. So it's a matter of safety, right? There's too much violence and attacks and deaths and killings that it's just no longer safe. Also, another impact of it was there was a transition in the Maryland's their governing structure. And I don't know if anyone's seen the newest video that was released recently about the Maryland colony, but it talks about the Calverts and their ruling or control over the colony. And it was when the Calverts no longer were ruling and controlling, and I can't remember the Lord at that time, but he brought in more of a Protestant influence as opposed to a Catholic influence.
Okay.
And it was during that time period, which is around the mid 1700s rather, that the change from the Catholic reservation system to the Protestant manor system. And it was through that manor system and the giving of land. It's actually interesting when you look at the historical record, when you look at that 1666 reservation treaty that reserved the land, so to speak. Prior to that 1666 treaty, those lands were already granted by the crown to settlers who had not yet come to this area yet. So once those settlers started to come to the area along the Potomac River, which is now present day Prince George's, Lower Prince George's, and Charles County, starting to claim their land grants, that you started to get squeezed out a little bit.
Yeah.
And it was no longer safe. So there was issues around like pigs destroying crops and you can shoot someone and kill them, and blah 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 blah. So yeah, it was for safety reasons.
Just try to find a space of your own, sort of an arrangement. Something I wonder about is something that I see when I'm talking to folks about Maryland history is often the fact that what happens in Maryland is different than what happens in other parts of the country. The Maryland history is often different. Is that sort of the general theme with Indigenous history as well, that Maryland's Indigenous history is different than other places and within the United States?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that. I think the one thing that really did make Maryland as a colony different was the religious tolerance, right? So you had predominantly Catholic, right? And our ancestors converted to Catholics. Well, the surrounding colonies, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, were Protestant. And that actually impacted our people greatly, because when you're Catholic, you got to marry Catholic. So it kind of made things a little challenging. Yeah, so there's that. So I would say you would need to look at what was the colonial influence, whether it was French, Spanish, or English. That also had a lot. A lot of people don't realize, or maybe we do, but we don't remember. You had French colonizing most of the North and Canada, and English colonizing kind of mid-Atlantic region. Then you had the Spanish to the south and out towards the west.
So I think we have one more question. We'll let people get back to work. Just about the archival research that's been done and what that process is like of merging that or using that to complement the native traditions and the native histories. Is that something you can talk about? If that's too broad of a question.
Yeah, can you rephrase that?
So where I work, we have a lot of archival records. It's what we have, and I always, when I'm looking at records, I often feel as though there's another part that's missing. And when you're looking at it, records that are related to Indigenous people, usually there's something missing. Knowing that there's another part of that history that's not within the archival records. How do you go about, how do you collect the native history and make that so you can come together with the recorded history, the European history?
Okay, yeah, I hear you. So it's interesting because it's, and I see a comment, and I'm going to kind of answer both questions in this. It's in how those, the people were described in those histories. And so there were a lot of different terms in written history for Native people. Sometimes you will see a name reference. There is in the Mattawoman area, there's a reference to an Indian George. And so there's just very, very small. You have to really look hard, and you've got to be wanting. That's the key. You got to be wanting to look for it. It's very easy to not see that needle in the haystack when you're looking through and sifting through a lot of the colonial record. And it was also challenging because of the different spellings. And I'm really appreciative of Maryland State Archives' work with the MIE system. I mean, there's 5,000 different ways to spell Piscataway in the colonial record, depending on how you're interpreting, if that's a T or an F or two T's or one T, right? And our language wasn't written, it was phonetic. And so who the writer is writing how they hear it, but they're not, the writer is not familiar with that spoken language, right? And our dialects are different. So there's one challenge there. The other thing is knowing, how our people refer to ourselves during that self-preservation period. Again, it was not safe to identify as a Native American. It wasn't even like the census record didn't even, start identifying Native people, because if you identify Native people, then you have to give them some sort of land rights. So that was, again, by design. But there is a term, I don't like using it, but it's called wesorts. That's often attributed to our people. And in the colonial record, our birth records way back refer to all the Native folk as, or Piscataway specifically, as wesorts. In the Catholic churches during the segregation period in the 1950s era, or leading up through the 1950s, they actually were segregated seating areas, and you had 3 separate seating areas for white, black, and we sorts sat in different areas. It was very different. And so in our community, everyone knew who you were. And that's how we were able to continue to preserve our identity and look at those records with a little bit of a finer microscope of looking for the nuances of how people were being described as.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, I think that's all we have about time for today. Thank you so much. This was such a wonderful presentation. I hope that folks who are interested in learning more will check out the Accokeek Foundation's website and make a trip down to Accokeek and see everything that they have. Angela, thank you so much.
Thank you. You guys
all
have
for watching.
day.
Sorry, thank you all for watching. We'll see you next month.